Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Seafarer Social Podcast. We're nearly wrapping up the year, but we have still some time for a few more episodes, and I'm very, very honoured to say that I am today joined by a fantastic guest. As none other than Frank J. Coles. Frank, for those who don't know Frank has an unbelievably deep resume within maritime, working across numerous different companies. He has his master's ticket. He was serving at sea for 12 years, and since coming ashore has worked for a huge list of companies from Pacific Basin, Inmarsat, Wallem Group, Wartzilla, and so many more. It's an extremely impressive resume, and as such, I personally feel very honored to be in the presence of someone with so much experience within the maritime industry. But before we get into any of that, how's things going, Frank?
Oh, they're going very well, thank you.
Are you surviving in the other side of the pond?
Yeah, I'm doing very well. I'm semi-retired, I guess you could say, at the moment. I spend my time doing consultancy stuff. I've done this year. I've been busy on a number of acquisitions across the spectrum of maritime. Was involved with the possible buyout of a pretty large ship management company, which didn't go anywhere in the end. Was involved in a fairly large acquisition of a technology company this year, again with a private equity firm that didn't in the end win the deal, but still involved with it. And I've also been helping a number of startups and still involved with a startup that is looking to do something in the ship management area with
Nice.
AI and safety management systems and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Very cool. And you also told me that in your spare time, you and your wife still enjoy to sail whenever you can as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, we spent the last 3.5 years. When we came back from Hong Kong, we had a catamaran in Hong Kong, which we intended to sail back from Hong Kong eventually, but COVID got in the way of all of that. Then we came back here, sold the catamaran, and bought a powerboat, an older boat. Sold our house, moved on board, and spent 3.5 years sailing, which was, for me, was really interesting because it sort of tied up with the advent of Starlink coming out, and it enabled me to test all the different systems and actually use the systems rather than just talk about it on LinkedIn or in the maritime press, and actually get real life experience of how this stuff works, and listen to the BS that people were putting out. But it also allowed me to work from home. Just because my home was the bridge of my boat and was in nice luxury places. You know, boating is fixing stuff in luxurious places. It's not all beaches and sun. It's fixing your boat while the sun is shining outside. But
Well, it's interesting. Yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting you mentioned that because my beginning into the maritime industry was actually through the leisure sector.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm based in an area where a lot of people in England keep their boats, and that's how everything started for me. And every single boat owner or every single dealership or outboard service provider, everybody who's related to boats has basically said to me, if you own a boat, be prepared for an endless bill because all it is a non-stop expense.
Well, boat stands for bring another 1,000. So bring on another 1,000. That's the BOAT.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, we still have the boat. It's in Washington State at the moment, and we'll see if we go back to it. But for now, I'm land based and busy doing stuff.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into that stuff. But before we do, I think it's important to understand where this all started for you. So, without being presumptuous, from your accent, it sounds like you were raised in South Africa. Am I right in assuming that? Is that
No,
where things started off for
no,
you?
no.
No.
You don't tell a Rhodesian that they're from South Africa, just like you don't tell you don't tell an Englishman he's from Scotland. So
Forgive me.
that's fine. I was born and grew up in Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe. And I left when I was 17 and a half, 18. Came over to the UK. My family I was first generation born outside of England. And I joined the British Merchant Navy when I was 18 years old. So that's kind of how that all spun off.
And what inspired you? What was it that attracted you to the Merchant Navy?
See the world. I mean, I know it sounds cliched, but I'd grown up in Africa. It was fantastic. It was amazing. Wild animals on your doorstep and all of that other stuff. But I would travel to England with my parents to see relatives, etc. And it was like, okay, well, I want to see the world. And I knew I didn't want to be just tied up. So, and I had my mother had brothers who were all, my mother was from Portsmouth and had brothers in the Royal Navy, etc. So that was kind of how it all came about.
Nice.
Yeah.
We seem to have a very similar upbringing. Cut the Africa part out, but my mother too is from Portsmouth. I am in Portsmouth right now,
Oh,
and
okay.
my whole family are Navy, ex-Navy.
Ex-Navy. Well, there you go.
So yeah, this part of the world definitely has a very big tie to maritime, albeit Royal Navy instead of Merchant Navy. Did you ever consider the Royal Navy, or for you was it always?
I tried to get in the Royal Navy a couple of times. There were a few things, coming from Rhodesia, and there was a few things going on at the time. So it didn't come about. But I tried twice, and for various reasons, it didn't. Consider the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, but that was a bit too stuffy for me. And by then, I was too much of a merchantman to really want to be in the Royal Navy. And you don't see the world the same way, really.
Yeah.
In
No,
my view.
I've heard the same.
I was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy Reserve for about 5 years.
Nice.
Um,
Yeah, I wonder if they'd make it as difficult for you now because they are absolutely desperate to find people.
Well, they've got any boats? I mean, they sold most of the boats. I mean, and Labour's going to
Exactly.
get rid of the rest of them as well.
I'll skip that topic, otherwise I might get in trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 12 years at sea, so that takes you from 18 to 30. When did you get your master's?
A couple of years before I gave up the sea,
Nice.
I did everything in Cardiff. I joined in what was really a heyday time. There was, I think, Shell had somewhere like 300 cadets at the time. Shell had over 100 ships. It was you were treated well, you had good time, you had good benefits. And then I did one trip third mate and they laid me off.
Oh, wow.
Along with thousands of others or hundreds of others.
What was the reason for that?
It was time to go east, young man. It was time to move to cheaper pastures. Shell moved out of owning vessels as many, and they didn't want to pay them the salaries for Europeans. I mean, it's the story, right? I've lived through that. I was thinking about it today, and when I went to sea, it's an interesting thing. When I went to sea, it was sextants, paper charts, Morse code, and European sailors for the most part. By the time I left, there was satellite navigation, and most of the crewing had moved to the east. I'd been laid off by Shell, and then I remember in 1986 I was working for a ship management company out of Hong Kong, and I got off my ship and I went home and I got a letter firing me from that company as second officer. And the next day I got a letter from the same person, but with a different letterhead, offering me the job back at half the pay that I was on the day before. So Indochina Steam Navigation was the ship management company that fired me, and Jardine Ship Management hired me the next day. The same person fired me that hired me. They basically just halved my salary and my working conditions.
And you accepted it?
I accepted it long enough to do a trip and find another job somewhere else. But that was de rigueur of what was going on in those days. And here we are. That's nearly 40 years later and nothing's changed, right? Or very little has changed.
I totally agree.
So that's Frank, pretty damning.
Yeah, I bet. I want to get really into the nuts and bolts of seafaring because when I was one of our mutual connections told me that I should have a conversation with you because you're somebody who is very outspoken online and really shows somewhat the reality of what seafaring is about and highlights some of the hard truths. And I think it's very, very important to speak to people like you because on this platform, we try to create a voice for the seafarer. There's so often we focus on the corporate side of maritime, that we forget the stakeholder, which is the end user, which is almost always the seafarer. But I have to, based on your resume, talk a little bit about your time in the corporate world, because I'm looking at it now. In 1990, you was a maritime lawyer for 5 years. 1995, you're general manager and operations director at Pacific Basin Shipping Limited. 1995 to 1998, CEO and president at Ridex Communications. 1999 to 2011, president and CEO of Globe Wireless. 2012 to 2014, president at Inmarsat Maritime. 2015 to 2018, principal consultant at Cayman Maritime Innovation. Then we go to 2015 to 2018, you was working at Wärtsilä, and you was part of the transition from Transys to the Wärtsilä Group. And then in 2018 to 2021, you was the group chief executive officer at the Wallam Group, and now you are working as a consultant for yourself. That's an extremely stellar shore-based career, if I've ever seen any of them. So how did this happen? What was it that happened in the 1990s all the way till now, where you was able to excel to the very, very highest point in C-suite level of some multinationals?
I don't know. I was pretty lucky in some ways, and I was probably kept my tongue in my mouth in the beginning, because otherwise I probably wouldn't have happened. Look, I came ashore. I mean, I had my master's ticket, and I knew I didn't want to be a master for the next 30-odd years, mainly because I could see the way the industry was going, and I didn't like the way we were treated. And then I was pretty active in the Nautical Institute at the time, and I won a scholarship to go back to uni, which is how I ended up doing law and getting a job at Richards Butler, now called Reed Smith. And they were very good to me, and it was a really good background. I was in London. I was working out of London. I didn't really want to stay in London because London was all dealing with insurance companies and P&I companies. And so I moved to Hong Kong, got a job in Hong Kong where you dealt with the sharp end. And it just happened that I went out to lunch with Paul Over from Pacific Basin. And he, after about 3 hours of a long lunch, he said, well, why don't you come and work at Pacific Basin? Come in the shipping industry. So that's how I ended up getting into Pacific Basin, and that was fantastic. That gave me the break. And the leadership in Pacific Basin was quite, at the time in the mid-90s, was very forward-thinking in terms of technology, and email was just getting going in the shipping industry. So they bought Ridex, and that's how I ended up being the CEO of Ridex. Basically, I was still working at Pacific Basin, and then eventually I ended up running that part of the business as one of the leaders in the ship-to-shore communication space and email. I mean, at that time, it was all very, very new. And then I got a job in America, and I ended up at Globe Wireless, which did the similar thing. We did technology. We were doing a lot of email, a lot of apps, and a lot of satellite data to and from ships. We became partners with Inmarsat. And after about 10 years at Globe Wireless, I moved over to Inmarsat and got a pretty good gig there. At the time that they were launching the FX, just getting going on the Fleet Express program. So I led that part of Inmarsat's maritime. And it was an interesting time also, because at that time, the VSAT side was starting to challenge Inmarsat's traditional L-band business. And I remember putting the prices up and being attacked on social media and God knows where. It was a very interesting time also for Inmarsat. And then after a while, I left Inmarsat, and I set up Cayman Maritime, and I was basically just living in the Cayman Islands doing scuba diving and taking a sabbatical. And I got a call from a headhunter to go and take over the CEO job of Transys, which was an amazing position. It was my best job ever, probably. I had the most fun because I was with some really smart people. So for 3 years, I was the CEO of Transys with a job description which basically required me to find a way to sell it, which is what we did after 3 years when Wärtsilä came in and bought it, because we had similar ideas about unmanned ships, simulation, navigation, all of that stuff. And funnily enough, just as that was coming to an end, the opportunity came up with Wallam to be the group CEO. And having lived in Hong Kong 20 years earlier, that was a really great opportunity for me. And I thought, yeah, I really want to do this. They wanted to do some change. The board said they wanted to change. They really wanted to do some transformational change. They were a little bit behind the eight ball in terms of getting ahead on the technological curve. And so I took that job, and I was really quite excited about it. But it very quickly became quite a big challenge in terms of change. But what was the worst thing, of course, was COVID came along and really smacked and challenged every ship manager in the world and challenged everybody in the industry. And that was the time when I really felt the urge to speak out more about seafarers. And the whole 35, 40 years of my background was just like came to a head, where I realized that we may have made steps forward in technology, we may have made steps forward in ship design, but we'd made no progress in terms of mariner welfare. We'd made no steps forward in terms of human rights at sea. Okay, we allowed women to go to sea, but that made things worse, not better, because instead of just bullying each other, now we're bullying women and abusing women as well at sea. So it didn't improve anything.
I think there's some really interesting points there, especially at the end where you talk about after being that level in the corporate world for 35, 40 years and watching all of these external transformations, seafarer wellness had really seen not much. And I think that's a really, really important point and something that I truly believe will change. I'm very optimistic, especially with my generation. I think that we think a little bit differently and we put priority towards those kind of things. Eventually, the next generation will be the guys who become the C-suite of these companies that ultimately have the power to, and these organizations that have the power to make a change. I also see some good positive steps with the IMO as well. I think one of the things I really want to address, though, two things actually, is what do you think people saw in you? What was it about you, Frank, that gave people the belief that you would be the right person to lead these companies?
I don't know. I mean, it's not really about me, is it? But I just think I had a good rounded education in the maritime industry as well as in the legal side of maritime, and then the technology side. So it provided a good blend, and I was all about change, perhaps a little unconventional. And certainly I didn't tolerate fools very well, gladly. I probably could have done with better mentorship and better management training. If I reflect back on my own, for all my strategic knowledge, I think we lack the ability to provide people with on-the-job training in management and that sort of thing. So it's good for me looking back and realize where I could have done better myself. But what did people see in me? You'd really have to ask them. I think I can be inspirational, but I can also be fairly intolerant of laziness and that kind of thing. It's interesting. If I think back, change is never easy, right? And it's driven by people and process with a good, healthy dose of technology.
Yeah.
But if the leadership doesn't want to change, it doesn't happen. And more importantly, if the workforce doesn't want to change, it doesn't happen. And when I say the leadership, I mean the board's got to be behind your ideas and the workforce has to be cajoled. And to some extent, you can only cajole them so far, and then they need to change or they need to get out. And if I can compare Inmarsat, Transys, and Wallam, they're three very different leaderships at board level. They were very different in each case. Two were private, one was public at the time. Inmarsat was essentially English. Transys had Russian shareholders. Wallam had a mixture of Norwegian and English. And then the workforces and the cultures were all very different. But the interesting thing was that they were all different segments of the maritime industry.
Yeah.
Inmarsat was communications, Transys was navigation technology, and Wallam was operating ships. So my benefit, my luxury, and was the ability to see across all of those different segments, and also to see when I got aggravated in COVID, I could see it from all the different angles.
Yeah, nice. That definitely gives you a very niche viewpoint.
Yeah. So, if I look back at the last 2 decades, it's significant in terms of how technology has moved forward. It probably could have moved forward a lot faster, but at least it's moved forwards to some extent. But not as, if you look back over the last 25 years, the structure of the industry still remains the same. And because the structure remains the same, the pain of change remains the same. Yeah, to get change on fuel, to get change on engines, to get change on training, and every single body, every single country has to put the two penneth in, and you end up with a watered down regulation, which makes it very hard to drive change, because there's so much flexibility in the rules that those who don't want to comply don't, or they do the bare minimum to comply. This is why training is such a contentious issue. Why bringing in new fuels or new train, it's all very difficult because they write a set of rules, but there's enough flexibility in the rules that those who want to do the bare minimum will do the bare minimum. Even the rollout of ECTIS, you needed to be trained how to use an ECTIS, but you weren't necessarily given type-specific ECTIS training. And the problem of an ECTIS for the crew, there was no standardization on where the buttons went or where the way the ECTIS worked. So if you had a Sperry ECTIS or you had a Ray Marine ECTIS, it was, or Calvin Hughes, it was a nightmare. And that's a problem of our industry in standardization, in training, in quality. And so, yeah.
Would you say that you are optimistic about change now? Now you are at the back end of your career and you're seeing
not necessarily. No, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic. I think, we've jumped to the end rather than the beginning. But look at crew welfare.
We'll do a big circle in a minute.
Crew welfare for me remains the same, okay, in 30 years. I see little to no difference in the last 30 years. What's changed in terms of crew welfare? Communications is better, only really in the last 5 years. Yes, it got a little bit better, but more recently, only the evolution of cheap and fast Starlink has really changed the ability for people on board to have access to proper internet. And even that continues to be a battle in the industry because they're gonna watch the internet too much or they're gonna watch movies for too long. So we struggle with how to improve things at sea, or we struggle with change in the industry. I'm not hopeful. I mean, there was the point you made earlier in your notes to me. We can't leave crew welfare behind while we focus on climate change or we focus on environmental.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, newsflash, that's already happening, right? The ESG, the S in ESG stands for sucker, not for social. I'm sorry, you're a sucker if you go to sea. We've got a long, long, long way to go
But we need seafarers. We need seafarers. We'll always need seafarers. And I think my big thing that I'm trying to at least be a part of with Seafarer Social is how we can bridge the gap between seafarers and the wider public. Because actually, most of my buddies don't even know what a seafarer is, let alone the significance of the role that they play within their lives without even knowing. They truly are unsung heroes. And I've always had this theory that if we can create an appreciation to the wider public of what seafarers do, naturally, these issues that you're discussing have to change, because then the eyes of the world are looking. And when the eyes of the world are looking, legislation, action is forced. That's my theory.
I wrote this note when I was thinking about this. Advice on seeking change in the maritime. My belief is that change must come from outside shipping. Social media and podcasts are probably part of the answer, but not LinkedIn noise, because if you read LinkedIn, it's just everybody in the industry shouting at each other and drinking from the same Kool-Aid bottle. Social media with proper influencers who want to see change. But it has to be outside the industry. It has to be people who can really expose the dark underbelly of what shipping is. Nike made shoes in Indonesia or in sweatshops. Then it gets people like, what is this? Yet there's a whole sweatshop called the maritime industry. It really isn't much better than that. And I know people who will listen and say, oh, well, look at that cruise ship, or look at some of the more honorable shipping companies. But for every one of them, there's a whole dark underbelly of bad treatment, bad quality ships, etc. You won't affect change in the maritime press because their agenda is different. They've got to, A, they need advertisers to keep going, and B, they've got to placate the shipping industry. You won't affect change with the UK charities and well-meaning people from the UK because the sun is set on that empire. It's not the force that it was. You don't like it because I'm saying what, but you can't muster a navy anymore. It's countries like the Philippines and India that need to step forward for their seafarers. We have a podcaster over here called Joe Rogan, who Trump went on for 3 hours. And he went on because his youngest son told him to go on Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan was a liberal, but he came out in support of Trump. And that's the power of external forces, not within,
Yeah.
And love or hate Trump, he's not a politician, he's a businessman.
Yeah, I've always had this idea, Frank, just to extend on that. I've always had this idea that to pitch the production of a docu-series on Netflix where you had, say, 4 to 6 episodes, each an hour long, and each episode is just titled one of the countries of the major labor market. So one episode could be Philippines, and it's a 1-hour show where high production videographers come in and they follow from cadetship, the family, what they give up just to get their son or daughter through school. Once they're in school, how the quality of studies, once they graduate, how difficult it is to get that 1 year sea time.
Yeah.
For those that don't, what happened to them? For those that do, what then happened to them? How difficult it is. One of the things I've always found really interesting, I was actually speaking to a retired seafarer this morning as I was going for a walk with my dog, and he said to me, it's a real shame that some of the Filipinos that I worked with, and this is back in the 70s, 90s, where there wasn't as many, but there was still some. He said they weren't necessarily motivated to become officers, and I said, well, my experience of that is that 2 things. Firstly, sometimes they're quite happy with the money they're getting paid as a rating because that can actually create a huge impact on their life period, and maybe they're comfortable with that, and that's fine, that's their choice. But secondly, and more importantly, when I'm speaking to a lot of these maritime schools, except your PMMAs and stuff like that, they actually don't. They're not given the correct training to be able to actually go as far as wanting to become an officer. For them, just becoming an OS means they've made it because there's so few that get given that opportunity.
Yeah.
But yeah, going back to my point, Philippines, next one, India, and following the journey of these seafarers, these cadets. I think that's something like that, and being exposed to everything. Nothing's hidden. Complete life at sea, everything from the camaraderie, the celebrations, really good captains and leadership skills, all the way down to corruption, criminalisation, pirates, all those nasty things that get shut off. I think something like that could be really cool. And again, similar to what you're talking about in terms of the external world bringing light to something instead of the internal world trying to shout from the rooftops. Because I think you're right. And the point you made about Trump is so important. I watched the 3-hour podcast with Joe Rogan and I thought, my God, this is so powerful. Because firstly, it doesn't matter even if you are an industry robot, nobody can talk for 3 hours like an industry robot. After you get past maybe 1 hour, but once you get into those 2, that second hour, that third hour, that's when really the real person comes out. And I think Trump is, I think he's a great leader personally, but I might get a lot of trouble for saying that. I think he's a fantastic leader when it comes to actually being able to do what he intends to do because he believes it's right instead of doing what the lobbyists believe.
Well, he's in the fortunate position that he can do it because he's not beholden to a political. He's got his own. He's a businessman. You don't have to like him, but there's a reality now that over half this country voted for him. So it is what it is.
But, I agree.
That's how you bring change, in my view, and that's why I think social media would be a big part of this.
I totally agree, and I think what else was really interesting from that whole cycle, and the reason why I want to lean a little bit more into it, is that there was a man who wanted to achieve the biggest thing that can happen in America, and that is become president. And he probably has a team of hundreds, if not thousands, of advisors, representative of consultants. However, it was his 18-year-old son that advised him he should do this podcast circuit. And it wasn't just Joe Rogan, he did tons.
Mm-hmm.
And many people are saying, the campaign itself, but many people are saying that podcast circuit he did was pivotal in casting some of the votes he did, which may have been what won him the election. So I think the point you're making is really powerful. Working with the next generation, so the young people like Trump's son, and getting their advice on how you can be exposed to the external market. And that's exactly what we're trying to do at Seafarer Social with shipping. So that's my idea, but let's see. It's going to cost a lot of money. Who's going to pay for it? That's always the big problem.
Well, you won't get it from within. I just don't believe that you won't get the industry giants to make those changes, because it's not in their interest to do it. It becomes expensive. It's also that they're much more focused on sustainability at this point, because we're being beat up.
I see a shift. Honestly, I do. I know that LinkedIn is full of a lot of jargon, but I see a lot more people now getting behind human capital management than sustainability. And
where do you see it? Where do you see it?
Well, some of the big figureheads.
Where?
I love Stephen Jones, the guy who writes the happiness index. That gets a lot of eyeballs, the happiness index. A lot of people refer to that document. The new Secretary General, Arsenio, I believe is how you pronounce his name, for the IMO. The first thing he said is that I don't want to talk about sustainability. I want to talk about people. I believe this is a people industry.
Yeah, but Arsenio I met 10 years ago. I haven't seen him since. I mean, Stephen Meads well. We sponsored it at Wallum. We made the first decision to be the industry sponsors of the happiness index. But it's not enough. People will crucify me for saying it's ineffective. It's not enough. It's not enough. It's not bringing change. It's highlighting it, but it's still the happiness index is shared in the industry. It needs to be outside. We need to get outside. It needs to bring change. I mean, you asked me where my passion for the advocacy for seafarers comes from. Well, it's driven from a lifetime of watching the erosion of the profession in terms of respect and rights, right? And COVID drove home the disdain for seafaring that exists. And maybe you can say there's no disdain, there's just blind ignorance because nobody actually knows. But, let's be honest, cruise ship captains and crew are not what we're talking about. That's not maritime. But there's no incentive in the industry to change the lives of its seafarers. It's costly, it's fragmented. They lack the power or the desire to really make a difference. And COVID showed the inability and the ineffectiveness of the various associations. And
I want to get into COVID.
When they really want to change, but I'm just telling you that COVID was where I just thought enough is enough. Think of this. We're an industry that relies on charity for human rights. We're an industry that relies on charities for social support and to feel good for seafarers. Yeah. And I've always been a supporter and always will be a supporter of charities. Lord knows I used them when I was at sea. And we didn't have the ability to call home. But it's a damning indictment of an industry that relies so heavily on the need for charities to support the well-being and support of our professional seafarers. It's mind-blowing. And until you have an industry force that has the same ability to regulate and police in the way that the FAA or the CAA or the airline industry is regulated, both in terms of quality of aircraft and pilot, you are basically have an industry which will continue to be the pirates of professionalism. There'll be lots of people, Stephen Joneses and Frank Coleses and our seniors, who will speak, and we will speak from different angles. And Stephen may say, well, Frank, you're too aggressive and he does it in a much more laid back. But the point is that why doesn't the leadership of the industry change it? Why isn't, because, well,
I think the why, I think the why, because it needs to be changed. I think will always come down to one thing, and that is money. My theory is, you mentioned that you think that if there is ever to be change, it has to come from the external world, which I agree with. But my second theory, and I would like to hear your opinion on this, is that we believe that there will always be seafarers because we've reallocated the labor market to areas where they need this position, regardless of how they're treated. But I've been to the Philippines and I've been to India, especially India. I've spoken to owners of maritime schools in India, and they've said we're struggling to find people. And the reason why is because, and it won't just be maritime that has this. This will be a generational issue, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. The Philippines, India, Ukraine, these are free countries, massive labor markets for seafaring. But there are also free countries that are massive labor markets for digital freelance work. All of a sudden, the seafaring labor markets aren't competing against specific external industries. They're competing against people now that can realize young people can make £1,200 a month from their laptop sat in their bedroom doing graphic design and SEO and digital marketing and AI. And it's never been easier. And the demand is through the roof. You just look on Fiverr, look on Upwork, look on these. So now, this could be the start that the shipping industry is going to be forced to change, because how will they compete against that? Why would an 18-year-old Filipino guy, maybe right now because he's not necessarily educated on the opportunities he has from the digital world, but why would an 18-year-old Filipino choose to go through the whole of maritime school, study for 2-3 years, hopefully get a job on board, to be given the work conditions he's given, to earn $1,500, $2,000 a month, yes, tax-free, when he could earn $1,300, $1,400 sitting in his bedroom with a Wi-Fi signal? That's the reality now. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I agree with you insofar as there's more choices now, and the attractiveness of being in a metal box for 8 months of the year or 9 months of the year with limited welfare, limited benefits, poor access to home, no shore leave. These things have to change, and maybe that's what will change it. Technological advancements. I mean, the conversation. The one benefit is if we were to move fast enough into new fuels or new engines, then the kind of person you need to operate the vessel or the level of education required now goes up. Well, the person who's going to get that education, someone who wants to handle a nuclear plant or a methane plant or whatever, he's not going to put up with a fucking metal seat and a piece of, a shitty cabin and crap food and no shore leave. So,
because his opportunities will be endless.
He'll go to sea if you give him a decent wage and he's away for 3 months and not 8 months. And this could change tomorrow. It could change tomorrow if, say, the US and China, or the US and somebody just said, right, we're going to have nuclear ships and we're going to have people trained this way, and it would just happen. But there's no drive for that. There's no impetus for that. There's no leadership for that. So it'll be a bit of a chicken and egg. If we get to a place where we agree the right fuels and the right engines, then we better find the right people. Yeah. And the right people won't go to sea if they don't have the right conditions. So yeah, I there will be change. Just whether it'll happen, it hasn't changed for hundreds of years. So this could be the social revolution rather than.
Yeah, and I think it will be. I truly believe it will be. Maybe I'm naive, but I truly believe it will be.
You have to believe.
Yeah. Exactly. You have to believe. We've mentioned it a couple of times, and I really want to dig into it now, because I think of everybody I've spoken to, you are somebody who is very outspoken when it comes to COVID-19 and how seafarers were treated. Let's talk a little bit about that. So what did you see, and what are you comfortable with sharing during the pandemic that really opened your eyes to how the reality of how seafarers are treated?
It was look. It was a tough time. I made some notes. So I was trying to just get my head around it. But what you saw was countries. There was a level of disgust that happened inside me that created a problem for me in my role. Because as the group CEO of Wallam, obviously my first or one of my more important roles was as a representative of the shareholders and the ship owners that we managed the ships for. But it was also for the seafarers that we had on our books and that were at sea. And when you have a situation where all of a sudden there's no shore leave, there's no flights home, there's contracts coming to an end with no end in sight, when you've got other seafarers who are at home with no salary, no money coming in because they thought they were joining another ship in the next 2 months. It was as big a problem for the seafarers sitting at home wanting to go back to sea as it was for the seafarers stuck on board who'd been there for 8 months, 10 months, 12 months, 14 months, because the guys at home needed to get on a ship too. And then, so you had that pressure. And then you saw governments shut down countries without any sort of real understanding. They would clap for their nurses as they went to work. Fabulous. But who the hell do you think was feeding these people? Who do you think was bringing the goods? Nobody thought about that. And then when you saw the behavior of some of the ship owners, and this was where it really came home to me, that it didn't matter what kind of owner you were. It depended on whether you had a social conscience or whether you were a reasonable human being. And I saw ship owners, I saw the good side and the bad side of ship owners. I saw 2 ship owners in the same city, New York. I saw one ship owner prepared to pay 100% bonuses to their crew who were over there in 8 months. And another ship owner who wanted us to divide $1,000 between the whole crew for the fact that they were away from home. And the same ship owner ordering us to switch the internet off on board the ship because they didn't want the crew communicating to other ships to find out what level of bonus they should be asking for. The turning off the internet so they couldn't discuss about the bonuses was one thing, but by turning off the internet, now you can't communicate with your family in the middle of a world crisis. I mean, who gives that kind of order? Who gives that kind of order? Heartless. It disgusted me to the point where it just became something I had to speak out about. And it blows my mind today while I talk about it. As I said, I was in a conflict because I was the CEO of Wallam and I owed my allegiance to my shareholders and my owners. But the way I saw seafarers forgotten, exploited, and abused disgusts me today, disgusts me now. Not by Wallam, I might add, but by the general malaise across the world. I was even personally accused by one owner that I was trying to create a mutiny on board ship because the captain refused to sail any further. There was a complete disregard for human life. And so for me, if I show very little faith in the ability of the industry to change unless a gun's held to its head, because there were owners there that I think it's always the few that create the problems for the many. And that's what I saw with some disgusting behavior. But it also was the point that I was bringing to you earlier, where I say to you that we lack a voice and we lack power and we lack leadership, and we don't have the critical influence to generate change, because much as the leadership in the associations and that would speak up, governments weren't listening. Either because they were rigid in their fear of COVID, or they just didn't believe that the maritime seafarer mattered as much as everybody else. It's just terrible. The fish rots from their head. And at this point, the leadership of maritime is rotting. And we have no leadership, we are fragmented, and we have no drive to make that change. Unless, we don't have a unified body in this world who speaks with authority in maritime. We get them, we've got the Global Maritime Forum and that, but a lot of this still lacks the ability to create significant, powerful change, and certainly not at a rate that we need it to happen.
And of course, COVID-19, as you mentioned, was the tip of the iceberg for you.
Yeah.
But something that's been going on for a very, very long time, and something that only recently, after speaking to a few seafarers who've dealt with this or heard of awful stories way before COVID-19, is the criminalisation of seafarers. This is a really big issue.
Mm-hmm.
And one that I'm seeing some people are talking about. I saw the Nautical Institute done a few courses around this, done a few panels with lawyers, maritime lawyers around this problem. But I think, given your background, this is probably a very, very important subject to talk a little bit about now as well.
Yeah.
So for those out there who haven't heard about this, because, I hadn't, and many people within maritime have not heard of the significance of criminalisation when it comes to seafarers. Tell me a little bit about some of the issues, or just generally speaking, how unfortunate seafarers can become within this world of criminalisation, and some of the case studies that perhaps you've come across in your career.
Yeah, so it's an interesting topic. There's a desire, isn't there, to make somebody to blame, and he's the captain, so therefore he's to blame. He has the world at his feet, and you used to be captain next to God when you went to sea, way back. But then we had communication. Now you've got Big Brother ashore, and Big Brother does lots of things. He tells you when to sail, how to sail, what to sail. He tells you to sail even in bad weather. He gives you all sorts of instructions that you may not or may want to do. He controls your budget. He influences how much maintenance you can do on your ship. And I'll round this up. But the criminalization of seafarers is effectively grown from the desire to blame somebody. And in my opinion, there's very little done to expose what we call vicarious liability of the owners and those in the office when an incident occurs. So vicarious liability is where the office is as much to blame because they've failed to put systems in place, or they have directly influenced or ordered ships to do things which were inherently unsafe in the first place. But when the incident happens, the master is the one who ends up getting crucified, criminalized. And I'll concede that on occasion, the master should have done better, or the master could have done this, or the crew could have done this. Often you will see decisions in this industry where the captain does things for fear of losing his job or his career, and he's ordered to go to sea in unsafe conditions or do things that are unsafe. Or the ship fails for lack of maintenance, for lack of funds, because owners don't provide the funds at an appropriate level. So I think about criminalization in two different ways. There's the criminalization where the owner is not doing their bit to support the master, either in funds and maintenance, or in forcing them to do things that are definitely not safe, but for fear out of losing his job, he goes and does it. Now you could say, well, he could walk away. Well, he could, but it's not that simple. Then you have the whole drug problem that's going on.
Yeah.
And I've seen this firsthand. We had a ship at Wallam. We had a ship that for 6 months did nothing but go from Colombia to the US for 6 months. And then at the end of 6 months, the charterer sent the ship to Korea. Except this time, the chain locker was full of drugs. And they trucked the ship all the way to Korea, the authorities. They knew the ship had drugs on it. It bunkered in Singapore. They didn't inspect the ship. The moment the ship got to Korea, customs came on board, went straight to the chain locker and found the drugs. They knew it was there the whole time. The ship had come from Colombia. Biggest haul in South Korean history of drugs. Crew was carted off. There was absolutely no evidence the crew had anything to do with it. We fought for months as Wallam. We fought for months. We had somebody based up there who fought for months to get this crew released. And eventually we did. And eventually Most of the crew went home, and then they kept the bosun, and we kept fighting. And all I got from the owners was, well, when are you going to get our ship released? I don't know whether the crew's innocent or guilty. That's all they were interested in. And there wasn't a thank you when eventually the crew were all released.
How long? How long did it take?
Oh, nearly a year. 6, 9. I mean, the crew were very thankful, and we were very popular in the Philippines for the efforts we put in. But dare I say
Did they lose their license? Will they ever sail again after that, or is that it?
No, they were okay because they were never fully. The bosun was charged. The others were let go eventually, but they had no evidence that the crew had anything to do with the smuggling. And the bosun was like 50, mid-50s. He was quite old anyway, relatively younger than me, but he had no interest in being involved in this sort of behavior. And eventually he got back to the Philippines, but it took a long time and a lot of court cases. And the owner never once sent a representative to support us, or the FNI club for that matter. It was all Wallam. And so when I see this thing on the internet now of this captain locked up in Turkey and given a 30-year sentence, I just find it absolutely appalling. Absolutely appalling. Because he raised the problem in Colombia, that this was a problem. The ship had a huge amount of drugs found in the cargo. To give the guy summarily a 30-year sentence, he's basically forgotten, but for Titania and others, speaking up on LinkedIn. This criminalisation and almost guilty until proven innocent is, why would you go to sea in that scenario? Why would you adapt and take on a responsibility? And we should refuse to go to Colombia. But who's going to refuse to go and trade to Colombia? This is what I mean when I say the leadership of the industry does not take charge and does not support what's going on. It is a very real, and I think it's a real dark side of shipping, the criminalization of the seafarer. I'm not saying we should be blameless, but they do not receive the support that they deserve, and that's why I spoke up on it. That's why I contributed towards the fund that they are trying to raise. I mean, I tried to do and this is another poor thing. I put out what I called a green channel petition when I was at Wallam, or just after I'd left Wallam, because I couldn't do it at Wallam, about trying to create a green channel for seafarers during COVID. And I got over 16,000 signatures on change.org. But 292,000 people looked at the petition, but only 16,000 signed it. You didn't have to put up money. You just needed to sign this petition. 16,000 sounds great, but when you realize 292,000 people looked at it, it's terrible. And the same thing here. We're trying to raise 200,000 euro for this guy's defense, and we're at high 40s now. It should be easy. It should be easy, but we are the silent industry. I know the submarines are supposed to be the silent navy, but in truth, the merchant navy is the silent navy, because we live in darkness. We suffer from the sea blindness, and it won't change from within. We go back to the point we were discussing earlier. It needs to be outside. It needs to be broadcast. The message needs to come home. Seafaring, while honorable people who work hard and travel the world, they are without a voice, and they are without support, and they rely on charity to try and sustain their mental welfare. That shouldn't happen in the 20th. Yeah. It shouldn't happen. And, where will you put this podcast? Who will watch it? We need people, outside the industry to see it. We need people outside the industry to realize what's going on. It's a great
point. It's totally a great point. And I hope that with forced change or environmental change or external change, whatever it be, criminalization specifically is something that gets fixed as soon as possible, because this is too big of a problem to exist anymore. People are losing their lives aimlessly, and it's horrendous. And I feel so bad for seafarers that are caught up in these situations. And I've heard of so many problems where even the charities don't get involved. They're forgotten, and it's very sad. I respect your time, Frank, and I know we've done over an hour now. So I think to conclude, I really, really want to, because my biggest concern, Frank, is as somebody who comes from the advertising background and telling stories, a lot of what we talk about in shipping is negative, and understandably. But for somebody who's coming to the back end of their career now and been involved in maritime for so long, can you just tell me, what was it that kept you in? What was it about maritime that gave you hope, that always tapped into your interest? And then adding to that, what advice would you give for the next generation? Because there's a lot of bad, just muck in this industry, and for someone like me, it's exciting because there is a lot of room for change. And if you're the type of person that wants to get your hands dirty, that can definitely happen within maritime if the right people listen. Please tell me, what were the positive reasons, if any, that kept you around for such a long time, and what advice would you give to the next generation?
Yeah, and let me just I thought about this because when I see people talk about the maritime industry, it's a vast topic, right?
Yeah, sure.
And you see lawyers ashore and people who work in ports and people who work in the offices ashore. And that's still a part of the maritime industry. But that's not what we're really talking about here, or at least me. I'm talking about the seafarer. It used to be traditional that you would go to sea in order to get a job ashore. I think that's less likely these days. You can still get a job in shipping if you haven't been to sea, but still the case really in a ship owner's office or a ship manager's office that a large proportion of the people have been at least to sea for a short period of time, so that they have some understanding. What kept me going? It's the same reason I bought a boat when I came home from Hong Kong. The sea. There's something mythical, mystical, magical, amazing to see the sunrise and the sunset on the ocean. And there's something, for me, it's the journey, not the destination. So it's a bit like Africa, being born in Africa. Once you've been born in Africa, the sight, the sound, and the smell is always a part of you. And once you've been a seafarer, the sight, the sound, and the smell is a part of you. And that's why I stayed. I'm thankful for those 12 years. Sometimes I wish I'd done longer. But it doesn't take away from the fact that it's broken as well. We need to do better. We need to do better. It's sad that the welfare side has really slid down as the technology side has gone forward. And so what we need is the welfare side, the story, the human element side. We need that story told. So for those who want to go to sea, they need to tell their story so that the reality of going to sea is out there. I watch YouTubes of Indian officers or guys. They're mostly Indians because they're the ones who make the videos, but there's also Ukrainians and Filipinos, and they make the videos of life as a second officer on a ship or life. And they just need they need people watching those and not just tits and bums on sailboats. They need those videos to be the ones that go viral so that people really understand.
That's happening. That is
Yeah,
happening.
it's happening, but not at the level we need it to be. And it needs to be at a place where the story of maritime sailors, seafarers, mind you, their story is mainstream, and those with a social conscience see it, because the current maritime environment or leadership isn't going to make the change without external influence. Charterers could do it tomorrow if they really wanted to drive home the S of ESG, but it's not really being addressed at the level that it should be. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing quite like putting on your uniform and navigating a ship from A to B, and it's amazing to see places. But we need to create an environment, a new environment, which is attractive for those who want to go to sea tomorrow. And it needs to be a safe environment as well. Safe from an industry perspective, but also safe from a human perspective. Like I said, if Joe Rogan can elect or sway an election, then some good social media influencers can bring home the story of the dark side of shipping and make people change.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much, Frank. Appreciate your time.
All right, great.